Well, folks, we've got some pretty big news coming out of the U.S. today impacting trade with Canada. Specifically, some pretty major developments on the automotive front.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've got reports here about President Trump announcing these new tariffs on auto imports coming from Canada, and of course, the immediate reactions from Canadian political leaders.
Right.
So, our goal here today is to kind of break down what exactly this announcement entails, I guess, the concerns that are being raised by it and the immediate responses that we're seeing proposed.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting right off the bat is this isn't like a back and forth negotiation period or anything. These tariffs actually have a set date,
Right.
April 2nd.
Wow.
Yeah, which you can imagine this sparked some pretty strong reactions.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Mhm.
we're talking about a 25% tariff on all auto imports coming into the U.S. from Canada.
Right across the board.
Across the board. And President Trump's reasoning for this is to try to prevent these U.S. auto plant closures that we've been seeing and basically bring more car manufacturing back to the States.
Hmm.
And, his message is pretty clear. Build those cars in the U.S. and you avoid the tariff.
Right.
And he's even gone so far as to call April 2nd Liberation Day for the American auto industry.
That's pretty dramatic.
It is.
Yeah.
Now, for those who might not be as familiar, a tariff is essentially a tax that gets added to goods that are imported from another country.
Right.
So in this case, it would make Canadian-made cars more expensive for buyers in the U.S.
Right.
because that extra cost gets passed along.
Yeah, and I think, stepping back a bit, this kind of a sweeping tariff on a major trading partner like Canada has implications that go way beyond just the auto sector.
Right.
This introduces a whole lot of uncertainty and really kind of throws a wrench into these longstanding trade relationships that we have.
Absolutely.
Right.
And as you can imagine, the reaction from Canada has been pretty immediate. Liberal leader Mark Carney, speaking from Windsor, Ontario.
Which is a huge center for auto manufacturing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Has already pledged a $2 billion strategic response fund
Wow.
to try to support the Canadian industry.
Okay.
And he's also proposing an all-in-Canada network, which would be aimed at boosting domestic auto parts production.
Interesting.
So really trying to kind of shore up things here at home.
Yeah.
Now, Carney's argument is that these tariffs are really going to put a strain on the relationship between the two countries and ultimately will hurt American consumers as well as American workers.
Yeah, and that strategic response fund, that immediately raises the question, what exactly is that going to target?
Right.
Like, what specific parts of the Canadian auto industry are going to be prioritized?
Right.
And, even with that kind of funding, how effective can it really be in trying to offset this kind of pressure from the U.S.?
Yeah, great points. On the conservative side, we have leader Pierre Poilievre speaking from Quebec, and he didn't mince words.
No.
His message to President Trump was basically knock it off.
Wow.
He's calling these tariffs something that's going to create chaos in the market and possibly displace workers on both sides of the border.
Yeah.
He's also promising retaliatory measures from Canada if these tariffs do end up actually being implemented.
Okay.
Poilievre has even made the decision to sell his own personal investments in the U.S. and invest in Canadian companies instead,
Oh, wow.
directly tying that decision to, the threat that these tariffs pose.
Yeah, and, I think that really highlights the level of concern here. This isn't just political rhetoric.
Right.
He's putting his money where his mouth is, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if we kind of zoom out a little bit, his point about market chaos really speaks to how tariffs can disrupt these really complex global supply chains.
Absolutely.
These networks where different parts of a car are made in different countries all over the world and then come together for assembly.
Yeah, it's a very delicate system.
Yeah. Delicate. So to sum up the big picture here, the U.S. is poised to implement this 25% tariff on all auto imports from Canada, and this is set to happen on April 2nd.
Mm-hmm.
And the stated goal is to try to boost U.S. auto manufacturing.
Right.
This has, of course, triggered a lot of strong reactions from Canadian political leaders, and we're seeing promises of financial aid,
Yeah.
a push to strengthen our domestic production capabilities here in Canada,
Right.
and, a pretty clear warning that Canada's going to retaliate if these tariffs actually go into effect.
Mm-hmm.
So the big takeaway here is that there's a real potential for disruption to the economies of both countries.
Absolutely.
And, potentially a lot of strain on the trade relationship between Canada and the U.S.,
Yeah.
which, of course, has always been a very close one.
This definitely raises a big question for everybody listening. How will these kinds of really significant and sudden shifts in trade policy end up reshaping these global supply chains
Right.
that have been, so carefully built up over decades? And, beyond even just the economic impact. What does this mean for international cooperation when major trading partners start resorting to these kinds of unilateral actions?
Absolutely. It's certainly a lot to think about.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out.
To be sure. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll be back soon to break down more of the latest news.
Sounds good.